He's the county extension agent in island of Hawaii. The island of Hawaii is in Hawaii. And if you want to click on Mike, when you come up to speak, see him and don't click on. And also, recording.
Not working.
Extension agent on Oahu in Hawaii. Also, these are both my colleagues, and he's our. What's your title here?
Slideshow manager, cameraman.
Slideshow manager. He's our technician. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the IPA for asking me to give this talk. Really a history lesson on how a young medical physician was crazy enough to get into the Protea business way back in 1976. I arrived in California in 1972, and that was also an interesting experience. At the time, I became quite friendly with people at the American consulate in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I was applying for a visa to come to California to study blood and cancer medicine, hematology and oncology at a clinic in La Jolla, which when I looked up on the map, I could not find it because La Jolla is actually simply a suburb of San Diego. It's not a town in itself. But anyway, I indicated to the consulate that I was very interested in spending 3 or 4 months traveling through Europe with my wife and my 2 young children, and that I needed a visa that would be granted to me to give me enough time, because it was only valid for about 3 or 4 months, to be able to do my traveling before I arrived in the United States. And they said, no problem, just come in a few days before you plan to leave and we'll give you the visa. That's how easy it was in those days. And so my wife and my 2 young children, ages 3 and 4, traveled in Europe for 3 to 4 months before we arrived in California. And I started work at a place called Scripps Clinic, which was like the Mayo Clinic of the West at that time. About 200 physicians in group practice. Today, probably close to 800 physicians in group practice. It's a very large institution. And part of my practice was to do research in blood diseases and also particularly in iron metabolism, that is how to get iron into the human body through supplementation of grains, bread and pasta. That was my research. And I also had a general medical practice in addition to the hematology and oncology. And in that general medical practice, in 1976, I met a gentleman by the name of Howard Asper. Howard Asper was a very interesting man. He was age 75 at that time and had been the superintendent of gardens at something called the Descanso Gardens near Los Angeles, where he became a world expert on camellias. In fact, one of the best camellia collections in the world was at Descanso Gardens. And he had hybridized a number of camellias which bear his name today. Howard then went on to the Huntington Gardens, another huge, beautiful garden complex also in the Los Angeles area, where he was superintendent and then retired in 1962, I think it was. He then went on to a small nursery that he started in Escondido, California, which is somewhat inland from here, but fairly close by, and was doing some work with camellias, I understand, at the time, but a camellia blight took over and destroyed much of the camellia that he had. So he turned probably around about 1965, 66, to growing Protea, probably the first person to commercially grow Protea in the United States. And it was about that time that I met him as a patient. He wasn't particularly sick, it was a general checkup type of thing. And of course, he was fascinated by the fact that I came from South Africa and that he was interested in Protea. And he said to me, you know, I'd really like to be able to acquire a piece of land where we can grow Protea as cut flowers in volume. Of course, I had no financial wherewithal at all to even consider this. But about a year later, in my cancer medicine area that I was practicing, I met a very prominent accountant from the city of Pasadena, which is a big city just east of Los Angeles, and who unfortunately was ill with cancer, and I was able to help him a great deal. And he said to me, can I help you in some way? And I don't know, I said, you know what, I've got this other patient and we are interested in growing these flowers from South Africa called Protea, but we have no money to buy any land. He said, not a problem. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, let me see what I can do. So he introduced me to a very prominent La Jolla citizen who was in real estate, a man called Edward Muzzy, who had just sold a very large piece of land just outside of La Jolla and was very interested in investing further in land. And we got together and I explained to him what we wanted to do. He was very interested, and he then put up the money to buy what later became Zorro Protea Farms. He insisted that the land that was bought had to be in the path of development, and Howard Asper chose a piece of land which certainly was not the greatest soil for growing Protea, but it was in the line of future development, which is what they wanted. So in 1978, 40 acres or 20 hectares of land was purchased, and the name of Zorro Protea Farms was created. There's a history behind that as well. Where this piece of land was situated was once part of a 3,000-acre ranch owned by, at that time in the 1920s, probably the most famous film couple from Hollywood called Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. Douglas Fairbanks became very famous from a movie called The Mark of Zorro, and hence bought the 3,000 acres and named it Zorro Ranch. So we felt at the time when we started our business, Zorro was not a bad name to use, and that's how Zorro Protea Farms came about. We first imported something like 250,000 seeds from South Africa, and Howard Asper germinated these at his little holding in Vista, California, and later we brought the seedlings to Zorro and planted them. The soils were not great in many parts, as Mel Resendiz will tell you, very clayey. We had great difficulty with many of the Proteas. We did find that Protea obtusifolia seemed to really like this soil, and for some time we actually grafted other Protea onto obtusifolia rootstock, but that was a laborious procedure, and we never really went further with that. The land that we bought had water but no electricity and no telephone. So we started this business with using generators and batteries and a radio type of telephone with an office in La Jolla that would then be the sales part of the operation. Howard Asper, over a period of a year or two, hired a number of farm workers who turned out to be the Resendiz brothers, 5 of them, and their father, who came to work as farm hands. A major development was 1986, when under President Ronald Reagan, amnesty was granted to 3.5 million so-called illegal aliens in this country, and part of that, the Resendiz family eventually were on a path to citizenship and became citizens of which we are very proud in this country. We started off by growing seedlings and eventually choosing cultivars from those plants that we thought yielded the best Protea and propagated those. Mel Resendiz developed a real passion for growing and became an expert at growing cuttings and grafting the cuttings, and was really an important part of the business in the early days, and eventually became farm manager. Not only did we have problems with soil, we had deer that you would come and eat our plants. We had coyotes that were chewing at our irrigation lines, and we also killed up to 40 rattlesnakes a year on that property. So it was kind of an interesting thing. In 1981, our first blooms were yielded, and then we had the problem of marketing. Marketing Protea materials in those days was very difficult. They were not known, and we had to simply introduce Protea into the floral industry, and it was an uphill battle, but eventually we were able to find lots of florists that were starting to use them, and we were able to establish a successful business. We then, Mel Resendiz and myself purchased a 10-acre property in Rainbow, which is just around the corner from here. I'm sure you'll be visiting some of those properties. And in the same area that Dick Bonner was already growing Protea. And today, the Resendiz brothers have developed, when we closed, the Zorro Protea farms closed down in 1998 because the property became too valuable for growing Protea and was in the line of residential development. And today the name is interesting of that whole area has become Fairbanks Ranch, again named after Douglas Fairbanks, who originally owned that property. So Mel and I purchased 10 acres in Rainbow, which turned out to be very good decomposed granite soils on a very good slope with good drainage. And we started to grow Protea there. And from there, the Resendiz brothers, eventually when we closed down Zorro Protea Farms in 1998, they opened up their own business, which is today Resendiz Brothers Protea Growers here in Fallbrook. And I'm very proud of what they've done over the years, growing cut flowers in over 100 acres. And I'm also proud to see that Protea now being used widely throughout the United States, as René van Rems will tell you, incorporated into floral arrangements. You see them in magazines now of high-end furniture. You'll see Protea arrangements on the tables. And we started at Zorro trying to sell Protea pot plants, pincushions, mostly leucospermums, and that was a struggle, difficult to sell them because they were unknown, and of course today they're again widely distributed as retail plants. And I'm also gratified to see when you go around various parts of Southern California, probably even further up north, that proteaceous material has been introduced into landscape in a significant degree, especially leucodendrons and leucospermums. We also at Zorro got involved, as others did, in Western Australian native plants, and were growing Camelortium, Leptospermum, and Anagoxanthus kangaroo paw, which was a very hard sell as a cut flower and as a plant. But today, kangaroo paws are grown throughout Southern California in landscape gardens in a significant degree. So that's how I got involved in the Protea business. It was a lot of circumstantial things that happened that allowed us to get involved. And of course, I'm happy to see today how big a business it has become. And I'm glad that I was able to play a small role in starting it. Thank you. questions?
Are you able to stay around for the?
Yes, yes.
Okay, what we've decided to do is have a presentation.
And then question.
We'll have a question and answer period later after.
Pleasure, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.